Hi everybody, this will be the Sony A1E game settings video. I'll go over the SDR and HDR settings for game mode. Let's go ahead and let's get started here. So of course the main thing you want to be in game mode on the picture mode. I am going to go into a little bit more detail for each setting so that you know what you're doing with each setting, so you're not just blindly following a checklist or just something I just post on anywhere and you could just bam follow each one. But yeah, I'll go into explanation on some of the settings so that you understand what you're doing. So auto picture mode off, this I think automatically goes off when you change the game mode. Brightness on max, color 50. As opposed to the nomenclature here, that's really not what you think it is. Brightness, screen brightness or whatever, that's actually in another setting, which is kind of funny. But light sensor, if you have this on, it measures the amount of light in your room or whatever. It only makes your screen dimmer, and there's really no need for it, so always have that off. So for brightness, keep that on max, same thing as the other one. That's not really brightness setting. The way contrast works here, contrast is essentially how it sets how black the blacks are going to be and how white the whites are going to be and how bright the colors are going to be. So when you have it too high, it's just going to put things out of balance. You're going to lose some detail and so forth. You know, that scale of white or from black to white, and you have all the transitioning squares. This was the putting it on max has typically been a indication of losing detail on the high end, so the last white squares are going to be all mixed in together. Actually, there's a good demonstration here in Uncharted. So when you go to brightness, there, these whites here will typically blend together, and you're going to lose detail. But the reason why you can have contrast on max will be because of another setting, and I'll let you know. You actually don't lose detail, and you can see every transition, so you'll be perfectly fine. So let's go to gamma. Gamma, you want to set it to 0. Gamma is the target for TV calibrators is essentially a 2.2. You want to maintain that 2.2. Any lower, it's gonna make the screen look too washed out, too bright, too milky, so to speak. And anything higher than 2.2 is gonna look like you got more detail, but you're actually losing a lot of shadow detail. So the grays you're gonna lose out on. It's gonna look a little bit more punchier, but you're losing out on detail. And that's what advanced contrast enhancer does, and that's why you want to keep that off. So gamma, you want to set it to 0. These settings, you don't exactly always get the numbers that they're displayed there. Like especially for the Sony television, having it on 0, you're actually targeting a -2. So you're actually pretty close to the 2.2 right out of the box at a gamma 0. So you want to have that set there in game mode. For black adjust, it makes grays darker. You lose out detail. It doesn't look very good. Just keep that off. There's no need to put that on. And you want to maintain black level at 50. So advanced contrast enhancer in HDR setting for movies outside of game mode, there are some applications that it's actually looked pretty good and it didn't ruin the image. But for game mode, there hasn't been any situation where it makes it look any better, and it just ends up losing out on detail, messing with the colors. It doesn't look good. Highly recommend you keep that off at all times. No need to put that on. Extended dynamic range you want on high, and that will be very bright initially, too bright in fact, but don't worry, because of black frame insertion that we're going to put on in a second, it will make it less bright, and you won't, if you like it that bright, well, you're not going to be able to have it that bright and also have the motion clarity that I'm going to go over in a second. But yeah, it is way too bright, but of course, the brighter, the nicer it'll look initially, but you don't always want to go by that. You want to let your eyes adjust to each setting and go with the closest to accurate settings. Of course, these are settings that are non-calibrated. This is for out-of-the-box use for people that just buy the TV, want to use it, don't want to pay $200, $300 for a professional calibrator to come and calibrate the TV. And these are settings that I figured out after using the television since April when the TV came out. I was one of the first to get it in North America, and I've been extensively messing with the settings this whole time, and I feel very confident that these are the most accurate that you'll be able to get, at least the most enjoyable settings, the best looking settings that you can get out of the box. And it may not be calibration accurate, but they're going to be it's going to be great with the colors, great on the contrast, great on the brightness, and you'll get motion clarity similar to a plasma. So highly recommend these settings to try them at least when you get the TV. You want to maintain color at 50, hue 0, color temperature expert 1. It may be set to cool when you first get the TV, and that gives it that smartphone bright bluish hue on white screens kind of look. And yeah, some people may like that, but for television and for content, you're going to see it's not very good and it's very inaccurate. So you want expert 1, that's the closest you're going to get to sRGB out of the box, and live color off. Advanced color temperature, that's for calibrators. You can go in and mess with those, but for now, some panels of the A1E has shown red or green imbalances, but you know, that's something that you need to calibrate out of, and it's really not that big of a deal and not that bad, so you can just not mess with those. I've been using the Blu-ray calibration from I forgot their name, Hansel or H&J or something, and I've kind of been using those as a base for these settings. It's not going to be applicable for HDR, but it's close enough. The clarity setting here, you want it on sharpness. Reality creation will upscale your lower content like 720p, 1080p to look a little bit sharper. It's going to look a little nicer, but it increases input lag, and I feel it. So I usually feel input lag around 45 to 50 milliseconds, and that's way too high. It's not going to feel very responsive. I highly suggest you keep reality creation off. Maybe if you're playing an old JRPG or something, it probably won't bother you, but I recommend keeping it off for regular gaming because you're not gonna like the input lag. Smooth gradation, you want it on low. Medium or high, it's gonna smear the image on dark or very grayish scenes. I had that setting on high for so long, and I couldn't figure out what was causing these movies or televisions to look so smeary and very off, until I figured out, oh, it was this setting. On low, it's perfectly fine. It smooths out those color gradations in the sky and some other areas as well, and it looks very, very nice. So highly recommend you keep that on low. For the motion, go to motion flow, custom. It's going to be set just off or custom in game mode, and you want clearness on high. So that will dim the screen. It's going to look very dim. It's going to, well, not very dim, but it's going to look significantly dimmer to your eyes right away. It's similar when you go from a very inaccurate vivid mode to a more calibrated mode, where it's going to look less vivid, less colorful, less bright, but it's you got to give your eyes a little time to adjust. So keep it on high, play for a few minutes, you'll see the difference of the motion handling. Highly recommend you give that just a go at multiple games, but the games that are going to demonstrate it the best are probably side scrollers, even games that are very like detailed in their texture or even flat in their texture, like Kingdom Hearts 2, in the 2.2 HD collection, you'll see just how in focus everything remains when you're in motion, and that is highly. It's the best. It's the only thing that has been keeping me from buying LED LCD televisions, because of the fact that they just cannot maintain clarity in motion. And that's not necessarily their fault. That's the way sample and hold technology works. That's how this TV works too. All OLEDs right now are sample and hold technology, the same as LEDs. And the way that works is actually, I have this little drawing I did here to kind of demonstrate. This is from an example that someone showed me once, where essentially the way that sample and hold works is it will hold a frame for this long, suddenly and abruptly change the frame. So it's like a ladder where the frame will hold, change, but that's not how our eyes perceive it. So our brain creates this blurriness, this smeariness that we see when in motion. So if the image was still, it looks absolutely gorgeous in focus, but once there's any motion, it's going to look smeary, it's going to look blurry. And that's because of our brains, not because of the technology itself. Because our brains will see something in motion, we expect it to be up here, but the TV is still holding that frame, so it's like it's down here and our brain expects it to be up here, so then that creates that blurriness. It's a very technical way of explaining it, but it gives you an idea of how it works. So that's why I have the clearness on. What that does is the black frame insertion. Clearness is just another name for black frame insertion, pretty much, because what it's doing is it will add a black frame in here in this step process. So it will create the illusion to your brain that it's a smooth transition between the frames. So it adds a black frame in between so that it's not holding that frame for so long. That will decrease the smeariness, the blurriness, and it brings it very close, if not exactly the same, to my plasma. I've been using plasmas exclusively since even after they were out of production, and because of the motion handling, I can't handle LED LCDs motion handling. I did get LG OLEDs, and I used those for a couple years, but the smeariness and blurriness has been a problem, and I'm finally glad to be rid of it with this setting. The only downside to the setting is it does slightly increase the input lag, which I don't feel, so that's maintaining around 40 milliseconds input lag, if not lower. And connected to my PC, it actually brings the input lag down to about 16 to 20 milliseconds. That's the range that I've gotten when I tested with my input lag for the 120 Hertz setting on the PC. So yeah, highly recommend you use this. Give your eyes time to adjust to the brightness. It will be a little dimmer than without it on, but your experience in gaming will be drastic, and it will be improved drastically. Highly recommend that. Please try that out. Don't be deterred by the dimness, the initial dimness, because just give your eyes time to adjust. I bet if you play that even for a week, don't touch the settings, you won't even you'll be, oh, is clearness, is that even on right now? Because it looks very bright, it looks nice. So highly recommend you keep that on. For HDR settings, it's exactly the same. The settings are going to be the same, and I've tried to maintain that, to keep that setting the same, because you don't want to have to go into the settings every time you change from an HDR game to an SDR game. So these settings work for HDR games as well. So all the settings are going to be the same. Colors are going to be the same. Clarity is going to be the same. And of course, black frame insertion or clearness on high. So The downside to HDR though is that you do end up. Oh, and let's actually go back. Let's step back a little bit here with the contrast. Um, because of the black frame insertion, you're actually dimming the screen a little bit. So that step, that gradation, that scale, you're actually not losing anything on here. You're seeing all the transition throughout. So for HDR, for the Lost Legacy, Uncharted: The Lost Legacy, as my example, you are going to have to increase the brightness in the game setting because HDR does dim the screen a bit. Before I thought it didn't. I had the setting when I was doing my testing with that. The settings that I had and the scenario that I was playing, I couldn't see that dimness, and that was on me. I didn't test it thoroughly enough, and after doing more and more testing, I realized yes, it does make it dimmer. So the way to compensate for that, there is in the setting menu there is here advanced contrast enhancer that will make it look brighter, and technically it is making it brighter, but of course the biggest downside is that you're going to make the image look horrible. Colors are going to be off, the brightness sure you gain the brightness, but you lose out on detail. It doesn't look good. It makes the whole image look pretty ugly. So the way to compensate for that is you have to go in the game setting itself and get the brightness higher. So you're pretty much balancing out the game settings and the TV settings, and it works beautifully. I played it without it. I mean, I've played without the black frame insertion on and had HDR on. It was significantly brighter, and I had the brightness setting on 5 here, and it looks great. But of course, there's the smearing, there's the motion blur. So what I ended up doing was I put black frame insertion back on and put setting brightness to 9, and outside of that setting you would lose detail on that scale, but because we have the dimming of the HDR and the black frame insertion, setting it to 9 balances it out beautifully. It looks amazing, it looks great. Highly suggest you keep those settings. If motion blur isn't a problem for you, if all you've used was LEDs, LCDs, and you don't mind the blurriness, the smeariness in motion, go ahead and keep a black frame insertion off, so put clearness on low and have the brightness on standard, and it will run just fine. So, but for those of you that care about clarity in motion and having your game look not blurry when you're just panning the camera a little bit, for 30 frame per second games, of course, it's going to be blurry. That's just how 30 frame per second games work. There's nothing you can do about that. But for 60 frame per second games, it's going to look smooth. It's going to stay in focus. It's going to look gorgeous, and I highly recommend you keep it to these settings. Especially for side scrollers, they make a huge difference. So yeah, those are pretty much the settings. If there are games that don't let you adjust the brightness, I don't think I've played an HDR game yet that hasn't let me adjust the brightness in the settings, but I have to do a little more research on that. But yeah, it is a bit dim even for me with HDR and clearness on high. So I do recommend the brightness, going into the brightness setting and increasing that. Don't worry about losing the detail, you'll be perfectly fine. So yeah, those are the best settings out of the box that you can get with the A1E. I'm going to make a separate video about settings for movies and TV shows. This black line and this flashing is because of the black frame insertion, the clearness setting on high, but you don't see that in person. You won't see that in games. I haven't seen flickering on any games. I see flickering with that setting on movies, but I've never seen it in games, in any game, in any brightness, in any scenes. I've never seen it. So I don't know what is the difference between the game mode and the movie mode. Maybe it has something to do with the processing in Cinema Pro mode. But yeah, in game mode, you don't see any of the flickering. You don't see any of the black any of these black lines that are showing up on the camera or anything like that. So yeah, go ahead, tell me how you like the settings if you tried them out, or what you changed if you didn't like any aspect of it. And yeah, I will see you on the next video.